Okay, let me try that again. Welcome everyone to the Department of Art Design and Art History's Friday noon lecture series. This is our fourth of the semester and our final one being the end of the semester. So thank you all for being here. And I want to thank the Webster University Speakers Committee as well, who has helped to fund our speakers, including today's. So we appreciate their support. I'm Dr. Ryan Gregg. I'm chair of the Department of Art Design and Art History. And I'm happy to introduce today our speaker, who is another art historian, Khristin Landry-Montes, who is an art historian who broadly focuses on pre-Columbian art and architecture, global contemporary art, and the art of border walls and spaces. And we've been lucky to have her teach for us as well, including a course on pre-Columbian art last semester. She serves as an affiliated researcher with the NGO Inherit, Indigenous Heritage Past to Present, which is through the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And recently she has served as the project facilitator with Inherit's Yucatec Cenetes Heritage and Conservation Project in Yucatan, Mexico. That was funded by National Geographic. It was a collaboration through Inherit, a university in Yucatan, and 9 middle schools there. Her research interests include the structure of urban landscapes in the ancient Mayan world, materials and meaning in Mesoamerican art, and the production of maps in New Spain. And I know she just published an article on some of this, and I think today we get to hear some of that in relation to that with her talk today on life, death, and rebirth in the last great Mayan capital, which is a re-examination of the stucco frieze of the from the major pyramid at the Postclassic site of Mayapán, Yucatan, Mexico. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Landry-Montes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think everybody can hear me okay. Is that correct? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Yeah, okay, yes. Great. Yeah, thank you so much to the Department of Art Design and Art History at Webster University. And I'm especially grateful to Dr. Gregg for inviting me and then also having to reschedule because of some family issues, but for this talk today. So I'm really excited to be here, and actually we'll talk a bit about cenotes today, which are sinkholes, but this is actually a project that's very near and dear to me because it comes from a chapter of my dissertation. So it's actually the first time I presented this work. So I urge you all to be critical of what I say, and hopefully we can have a nice discussion afterward. And I also wanted to say I'm very excited to see many of my Webster students here, in addition to many of my Lindenwood students and other colleagues, both nationally and internationally. So I feel really honored that you all showed up today. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Everybody can see my screen. Okay, that's correct. Yeah. Okay, great. So I am gonna, because we have about 40 minutes and we have a lot of material to cover. Generally, if I'm in front of people, I don't use a script, but I think it's kind of necessary. At least it helps me quite a bit to keep with time in like Zoom conference schedules. So hopefully that's not too boring for you. I think there's enough discussion of decapitation and rotting heads that it probably won't be too boring. And it's, you know, earlier in the day, so we'll probably be okay. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. On the tropical plains of Yucatan, Mexico, lie the temples, palaces, and residences of one of the most influential pre-Columbian Maya cities. Known as Mayapán, the city was once a powerful center and one of the most important indigenous cities in the New World during the Postclassic period between 1220 and 1440 CE. Postclassic urban landscapes and the knowledge systems that gave rise to them are of considerable importance to dialogues in the arts and humanities, especially as the postclassic represents the last time the Maya would be self-governed before the Spanish invasion in the 15th century. Oh, and I will say that I minimized everybody so that I can also look at my full screen. So if you can't hear me at some point, somebody's going to have to shout at me, so please do so. In general, this time period was a time of great cross-cultural interaction and dynamic social change across what is now Mexico. Mayapán's success in this environment was due to novel philosophies of living employed by the city's joint rulers. This talk addresses how these frameworks were active within a major stucco frieze from Mayapan's central pyramid, referred to as the Castillo. Through an examination of archaeological and art historical work in the Northern Maya region, a consideration of theoretical perspectives exploring art's agency, as well as an analysis of studies in pre-Columbian Mesoamerican philosophies on existence, I argue the Castillo frieze was built to manifest that existence, meaning simultaneously in terms of the existence of the cosmos, agricultural fertility, and human life. So that's when I talk about existence and powers, those three things: the cosmos, the existence of the cosmos, agricultural fertility, which is important to human life, and is intricately related to cosmology and Mesoamerican and Maya thought, and also human life. All of these things are kind of interrelated. So when we're thinking about powers in existence, I'm thinking in terms of agricultural fertility, human life, and the cosmos all intertwined. So such existence was kept in balance through energies produced from sacrifice and struggle. These energies were brought forth by way of the Castillo friezes, detailed iconography, powerful materiality, and carefully planned location. Providing a place for these energies to materialize and engage the viewer were the purposes of the frieze, or the sculpture. As art historian W.J.T. Mitchell might say, these were the things the picture wanted. Alive in that centrally located place, such energies were anchored to and possessed by the very city itself, a testament to Mayapan's own religious and political legitimacy in a quickly changing world. The Yucatan Peninsula has been host to Maya civilization for over 2 millennia. More specifically, the modern-day state of Yucatan, Mexico, is home to over 800,000 speakers of contemporary Yucatec Maya, whose ancestors built some of the largest and most complex cities in the Americas. The most influential of these include the city of Uxmal from 850 to about 950 CE, Chichen Itza from 950 to about 1150 CE, and lastly Mayapán from roughly 1220 to 1440 CE. So there are many others, but these are some of the largest. Each of these cities functioned as the most important polity in the region during their respective ascendancies, and each held considerable sway over smaller centers across the peninsula. Of these places, Mayapán was the last and most artistically diverse city. Between 15,000 and 17,000 people are estimated to have lived within the walls of the pre-Columbian city of Mayapán, and it had roughly 4,000 structures. These included commoner residences, elite palaces, and both public and private shrines and temples. Perhaps the most notable structures, however, were the large pyramids, plazas, and associated public works, particularly sculptures and murals of the central precinct. That's what we're seeing here. Chief among these were the centrally constructed main temple pyramid complexes, and the most important was referred to as the Castillo. The structure that we see today is actually 2 pyramids, one on top of and encasing the other. The larger and later version visible to today's viewers, so that's what we're really seeing on the left, also on the right, but on the right we're actually seeing, if we look inside, this is the first stage of that temple, or the first temple that was there, the first temple pyramid, and then we see another one kind of encasing it. And this was a building practice in the Maya world, in the larger Mesoamerican world. But usually what you see today, or you encounter today when you visit Mayapán, is the second, I would say the pyramid that encased that first pyramid that was there. So again, the structure that we see today is actually 2 pyramids, one on top of and encasing the other. The larger and later version, visible to today's viewers, is a radial pyramid, just meaning four equal sides, with 9 levels and staircases on each of its 4 sides. These 4 sides were roughly oriented to face north, south, east, and west. The main staircase of the pyramid faces north and once culminated in 2 serpent heads, symbols of the pyramid's function as an edifice dedicated to the pan-Mesoamerican deity Kukulkan, the feathered serpent. The earlier version of the Castillo, encased within the pyramid described above, while not a feathered serpent pyramid, is similarly aligned to the cardinal directions and also has 9 levels. So we can kind of see that in the right photograph. This is the larger, later Kukulkan feathered serpent pyramid is actually encasing another one that is in a lot of ways identical or very similar, at least in terms of layers and levels and orientation underneath. And it's actually this first one, the one that got encased, that we're going to be looking at. So it is this temple, more specifically the stucco sculptural frieze constructed on 2 levels of the temple's southeast corner, that is the focus of today's talk. The scenes depict alternating episodes of fleshed and defleshed human or deity figures, with some figures that have niches rather than stucco heads. Human maxillary fragments, so pieces of the upper jaw, were found in one of the niches, along with an effigy stucco mandible. So they sculpted like the bottom part of the jaw out of stucco, but like left the top part of the jaw there as an actual human jaw. So these were found by archaeologist Carlos Peraza-Lope and his team several years ago. So this suggests that entire human skulls were likely there, or even heads that were in various stages of decomposition were placed in the niches. So the largest figure of the frieze is partially skeletal. This is the one we're really going to pay attention to today. He is positioned on the eastward facing southern corner of the temple, facing the viewer in what is commonly referred to as a hawker pose in Mesoamerican art or Maya art, a pose also associated with birth giving. His legs and arms are outstretched and bent. The figure has a skeletal upper torso, but all other parts of the body, including his lower torso, appear fleshed. Like other figures that form part of this frieze, the figure has a square niche where its head should be. He is flanked by 2 vultures and stands on a water band with a partially preserved stucco jaguar. Archaeologists Marilyn Masson and Carlos Peraza-Lope have identified the object beneath the figure's right side as a personified sacrificial knife, though this has previously been interpreted by art historian Susan Milbrath as one of 2 wings attached to the figure. Milbrath and Peraza-Lope proposed the figures may be related to sacrificial or ancestor worship cults. More specifically, they believe the frieze reflects warriors glorified in a battle or cultic death god figures. The human maxillary fragments, that upper portion of your jaw, could have been related to ancestor worship cults, as was typical of Kukulkan practices, for example. So the Kukulkan were a royal family that were living at Mayapán, and that also the Spanish encountered when they got there. And people today in Yucatan still maintain that last name. So it could also be that the figures were part of sacrificial rituals, which would be different from ancestor veneration. And sacrificial rituals might have involved decapitation, which was also common in Yucatan and in surrounding Maya regions. So the interpretations above imply the Mayapán frieze figures are either deities, other types of divine beings, sacred ancestors, or figures associated with ritual events. I demonstrate that beyond subject matter, the central role of such iconography or imagery, as well as the frieze's materiality and placement, what it was made out of and how it was oriented, was meant to present a liminal space between the binary opposites of life and death. However, the frieze was not a simple illustration of these concepts. Rather, it was meant to represent, materialize, or perhaps more accurately create, like simultaneously create, the energies of struggle related to life and death themselves at the human level, at the agricultural level, and also at the cosmological level. The extent to which art possesses its own agency continues to be a controversial topic in art history and related disciplines. So meaning, can art, for example, have a life of its own with the ability to act on and affect other bodies? Perhaps the most seminal theories of art and agency are those of anthropologist Alfred Gell and related scholars who discuss art as an active and influential agent within our own social networks. In Art and Agency and Anthropological Theory, Gell reviews art's role within an art nexus, wherein the artwork itself impacts other participants within the nexus. So this nexus, or this kind of web that he's describing, includes 1, the material index, meaning the art object itself, or like the thing, the recipient or the viewer, the artist or the originator of the work, the person creating it, and also importantly, a prototype, which is the concept or the material index that it is representing visually. So that's kind of the idea or the power or the energy that is influencing what ends up being the art, and possibly that ends up influencing the artist or whoever is making it, and then also in turn influences and acts upon the viewer. So that's what he's thinking of in terms of a prototype. In terms of the present project, however, Gell's thesis is perhaps more aptly demonstrated by archaeologist Jeremy Tanner's treatment of the terracotta army from the tomb of the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi. The tomb of the first emperor was a massive undertaking that resulted not only in an underground resting place for Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor to successfully unite warring states in China, but reproductions of the Yellow and Tangzi rivers created out of mercury, pits containing hundreds of naturalistic terracotta figures of state officials and acrobats, wives and concubines, as well as both real and terracotta horses and their associated carriages. The entire tomb represents a stylized mountain, and together with its contents served as a microcosm of Chinese order. In his chapter from the larger volume, Distributed Objects, Meaning and Mattering after Alfred Gell, Tanner takes the terracotta army as an example of how a prototype, or that original idea or concept or power, determines the character of what is then produced, the artwork or the objects. In his analysis, qualities of the terracotta army's material technology bind the original concept to the artwork. In turn, this relationship informs the character of the agency transmitted from the original prototype to the recipient. So this is kind of the way that the those original powers influence the artist and then what the art looks like, and then eventually impact the viewer. So Tanner argues that Qin Shi Huangdi's tomb is the extension, not just the representation, but the extension of the Chinese ideological principles of Sheng, a likeness, and its relationship to Qi. As Tanner states, Qi is a natural energy, which under the alternating influence of yin and yang gives rise to all that exists, the 10,000 things. The meticulous and lifelike sculptures produced en masse as a reflection of Sheng, as well as the other components of the tomb, act as extensions or analogs of Qi and its life-giving energy. The terracotta army stands in for this idea, extends into space these powers, and indeed was thought to have embodied Qi and the 10,000 things. The great number of these figures, as well as the order with which they were arranged, so these are formal qualities of like the composition now that we're thinking about. These suggest that the presence of the procreative and organizing principles that are central to Qi are there, and that's how they're getting manifested. And that's why the terracotta army is so organized, and that's why there's so many of these figures. That the terracotta army sculptures reflect great naturalism and minute detail, properties of Sheng, speaks to the power of the original prototype or the idea of Qi itself in influencing the artist and patron, who then carefully selected materials and processes of making the material index or the sculptures, the objects, to actually agree with and represent Qi. And that's how those original energies in this example are actually influencing the artist and eventually the work, and eventually then the viewer. So following this thesis, the figures of the terracotta army blur the boundary between prototype, or that original energy or idea, and what is produced, or the index, between original force or power and the materialization of it. This is accomplished by the terracotta army figures' material makeup, their order, their sheer number, and especially by their formal quality, the hyper-realistic way they were rendered. The addition of this is great. The addition of actual bodies of concubines, servants, horses, and carriages, as Tanner notes, function further to erase the boundaries between sacred cosmology, its life-giving principles, and art as object, or even art as art. This is more of a representation or extension of original force or power. So in a sense, with the addition of what we would say are real bodies, this sort of boundary between what is a human body and what is a terracotta body, or what is an object and what is living, are totally blurred. The example of the terracotta army that Tanner discusses provides a useful analogy for thinking in terms of how Mesoamerican societies, including, so when I say Mesoamerican, in this case I'm referring to Maya and Aztec, likely thought of and engaged with concepts of agency and artwork. Like the terracotta army, sacred Mesoamerican or Maya material culture did not exist as a representation of a prototype or idea, but rather as the extension of it. In the case of the frieze, these energies were understood as its in Yucatec Maya, which is the language spoken in the Yucatan, or the related concept of teot in Nahuatl, which was the language of the Aztecs. Both its and teot at their core were understood as creative energies that unified the world, but its differs in some ways from teot. Maya its was the vital energy present in many things, both seen and unseen. In colonial Yucatan, its was known to be present in a number of liquids related to life, including nectar, dew, juice, secretion from trees, and human fluids, including milk, sweat, semen, and tears. Many contemporary Yucatec Maya define it as such today. Philosopher Alexis McLeod interprets its as a cosmic essence or core substance, something that is always present in everything, from plants to humans to the cosmos. Its is also discussed as a cosmic sap by archaeologist David Friedel and anthropologists Linda Shealy and Joy Parker. Though not a direct equivalent, the Central Mexican or Aztec concept of teot shares some similarities with its and jewel. The term teot itself comes from Nahuatl, the language spoken by the Aztecs, and philosopher James Matthey has recently explored this concept at length in his book, Aztec Philosophy, Understanding a World in Motion. Like its, teot is a unifying energy. Its physical manifestations were reflected in energetic power. For example, the power of an earthquake, flood, or eclipse. And like its in the Maya world, nothing was without teot in that of the Aztec. Moreover, this energy was creative. This creativity occurred through conflicting interactions between binary yet complementary pairs of what he refers to as agonistic dynamic unity. And I'm not going to keep using that word because it's incredibly confusing. But anyway, teot was most perfectly realized in the world as these conflicts unfolded. In these pairs or these binaries, neither force was eternally successful, but rather stronger at times and weaker at others when it was checked by its counterpart. This primordial dance continued for all of time, keeping the cosmos and the human world and the agricultural world energized and in motion. And agriculture is so important because, and is part of this because this is an agriculturally based economy that we're talking about, so corn specifically. So here on this slide that we're seeing are some examples of these philosophies, including tree sap and nectar as manifestations of cosmic essences, as well as binaries depicted in the Aztec Codex page here on the left, where we see deities associated with life and death. Like the terracotta army half a world away, the Castillo frieze provided the material index through which a prototype or these powers could emerge, and similarly to the sacred codices or books of religion, prophecy, and fate. And that's, again, what we're seeing on the left. This is one page of an Aztec codex or a book. And so there were hundreds of these, probably thousands, that were authored and illustrated by writers and scribes and artists throughout Mesoamerica, so throughout the Aztec and Maya worlds. But unfortunately, when the Spanish came, most were burned, so we have very few of them. But in any case, they were books that house religious knowledge and calendrical knowledge and mathematical knowledge, in addition to possibly narratives. Okay, so similarly to these kinds of books of religion, prophecy, and fate, I argue that the sculptural frieze at Mayapán, as part of the most important building there, was meant as a mechanism or medium through which to bring sacred energies and powers into the world. So for the Maya, both codices and the Mayapán frieze, in a sense, brought these powers forth, or perhaps, I think more accurately, created them through their presence, imagery, materiality, and especially relationship to human viewers and practitioners. Thinking of imagery in the codices is already somewhat being active, is already somewhat established in my discipline, but this is less so the case for architectural art, though some scholars have begun the work of comparing iconography between architectural sculpture and painted books, or the codices. So for example, art historian Susan Milbrath and archaeologist Carlos Peraza-Lope have previously argued that the large east-facing figure central to this talk, the guy we've been looking at for a while, shares similarities with Maya codices or Maya books. Specifically, they suggest the elements attached to the figure's torso are bee wings like those depicted in the Maya Madrid Codex on pages 105 to 10. We don't have that picture here, but we do have a picture of the following. They argue that perhaps this is then representing some sort of bee god that was really important to ancestral Maya culture called Amusen Ka. Further similarities between the codices and the central figure of the Castillo frieze are reflected in the vultures that face the figure's head niche, so those birds on either side. So that's what we're looking at here. Milbrath and Pereza Lope suggest these birds resemble those seen on pages 18b and 42a of the Madrid Codex, and those on pages 3a and 36b of the Dresden Codex. Both of those are Maya books. The one, we're just using one example. So that the one example we're looking at on the right is page 3a specifically from what's referred to as the Dresden Codex, which was one of these Maya books of prophecy, fate, and religion. So to add to this, I offer that actually the overall position of the frieze's main frontal figure mimics the entire composition on page 3a of the Dresden that we're seeing here. So like that image, and I'll get into how this corresponds in a bit, but like that image, the Mayapán figure is meant to embody the ordered cosmos and the struggle between life and death and associated sacrifice that maintains such an order. Notably, this image binds that struggle in terms of the human struggle, the agricultural fertility struggle, and also the cosmic struggle. In the Maya and Aztec world, these were intimately connected and all are intertwined and kept alive and balanced and in motion by essences of Itz and Teot. So I'm going to get into what we're looking at in terms of iconography in both of these cases and how they relate. So on the page of the Dresden Codex, or the book that we're seeing here on the right, the world is represented as a quadripartite or four-part world tree, or axis mundi, meaning also the center of the world. A vulture sits on top of its branches, and in the vulture's mouth are the long entrails of a sacrificial victim's eyeball, including optic nerve. So we're seeing that the vulture here on the top, in its beak, it has like a long line that extends all the way down to actually this human's face. And so that's actually the optic nerve, and he's plucking that eyeball out. So the sacrificial victim himself, which is in the middle here, is positioned midway down the tree's trunk with his belly cut open. Below the figure, the tree morphs into a bifacial chalk face creature whose faces form the opening of the earth. So at the very bottom of this tree figure are kind of simultaneously the roots of the tree that turn into these reptilian figures that in some cases have been interpreted as the rain god Chalk, and they kind of open up as also like a cave into the earth. So this part of the composition is a reference to water. Caves are associated with water, and in the article that Dr. Greg referenced, where I'm focusing on cenotes specifically are sinkholes that are very common to the Yucatan Peninsula, and they contain fresh water, and they're very important because they're the only natural source of fresh water in the area beyond seasonal rainfall. And so caves and cenotes, or these sinkholes, are oftentimes associated with rain, water, and fertility, because you need water for agricultural fertility, and they're also very womb-like. So Chalk is a Maya rain deity, and the cave or cenote formed by the open mouths of the tree's base signify the earth's opening up into the watery underworld. The entire outline of the tree, along with a zoomorphic cave opening, reflects a quadripartite space referencing a four-part world tree with the tree trunk and the sacrificial victim right at center. The combination of these elements in this manner communicates long-held ideas about the role of sacrifice in maintaining a balanced cosmos, the renewal of human and also agricultural life. Notably, the figure appears neither alive nor yet dead on page 3.8 and is caught in a liminal space between these poles in a struggle between life and death. The imagery on this Postclassic, the time period, Codex page suggests that it was intended as a space where Itz and the sacred essence of Chul that comes from human blood sacrifice could be manifested. Simultaneously, the page reflects the space of Teo as the struggle and journey between life and death and the energies that are generated out of that struggle. While not an exact reflection of this codex page, the main figure of the Mayapán frieze, which we're seeing on the left, maintains the chief elements of this scene, especially if one believes the frieze could have been used in rituals of sacrifice. The figure stands in a quadripartite pose, 4-part pose, with arms up and bent and legs out and bent, much like the central tree in the codex and its connection to the reptilian creature there at the base. The Mayapán figure is also flanked by vultures, and if a fleshed head were placed in that niche, the vultures could be posed to pick an eyeball or two from the figure, as the bird does with the sacrificial victim in the Dresden. Rather than culminating in reptilian creatures, the figure stands on a water band, but this direct reference to the watery underworld just more explicitly takes the place of the reptilian creatures with reference to cenotes or caves that in turn symbolize the sacred eats of a watery underworld. Perhaps not mutually exclusively, the frontal crouching stance of the Mayapán figure is also similar to the birth-giving squat seen in Aztec art further north. A famous example comes from the monolith. So that's what we're seeing on the right. This thing is enormous. So a famous example comes from the monolith sculpture of the earth goddess Tlachtlicutli from the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, as well as from a ritual sequence depicted in the Aztec Borgia Codex. But we're not going to take a look at that. We'll just look at this monolith. These birth-giving poses present liminal physical states between life and death and upper and underworlds. The condition of birth giving, for example, is a space, a time between the chance of new life will come into the world and the very real consequence of death. Birth giving poses reflect the physical struggle of both mother and child, and also the letting of precious sacrificial chul in blood and embryonic fluids that will be shed during childbirth. At the cosmic level, the Aztec earth deity Tlachtlicutli, who's seen on the right, is often shown in this pose. Her monolithic stone from Tenochtitlan is just one example. Like other Aztec deities, Tlachtlicutli had several different manifestations. Primarily, however, she was associated with the nourishing but also violent power of the earth. There's a lot of earthquakes in central Mexico and the area where the Aztec built their capital city, so it would make sense to associate a deity with earthquakes. Tlachtlicutli's frontal pose often directly articulated her with the earth itself, as she was frequently carved on the underside of monuments. When her image was seen, as in pages from the codices, Tlachtlicutli's hawker pose, or this birth-giving pose, aggressively engages the viewer in its frontality. Simultaneously, she embodies the sacrifice necessary to nourish the earth and keep the cosmos and agricultural fertility in order. Blood streaming from her mouth, that's blood coming out of her mouth, by the way, as well as skeletal imagery at her joints reflect this. I'd argue that the positioning of the central figure at Mayapán closely mirrors Tlachtlicutli's pose as well. So these are some of the comparisons that I wanted to make beyond the codices, beyond the Maya codices, and look a little bit further north, because this was also a time period when the Maya in this region were in greater communication with societies further north in the Valley of Mexico, and eventually, possibly even the Aztec. So perhaps if the Spanish had not invaded, there would have been a lot more interaction, but certainly that would have been the case. But in any case, I think now what we'll do is leave iconography behind, and we're going to look at placement, composition, and materials of the frieze. Oops, not that yet. So if the central frieze of the Castillo reproduced the iconographic tropes involved in representing struggles between life and death, the niches of the Castillo frieze acted as framing devices for it. So we're going to look specifically at those niches without heads. It is quite likely that human heads in varying stages of decomposition were placed in the Castillo frieze's niches as a reminder of the process of life, dying, and death, and the energies these sacrifices and struggles produced. This is similar to the practice of displaying heads in varying states of decomposition on some pontlis, these structures that are skull racks, actually. As art historian Virginia Miller and anthropologist Vera Tiesler have noted at nearby Chichen Itza, this is an earlier, larger site, The heads depicted in sculptural relief on the face of its skull rack or tzompantli provide artistic evidence for this practice. The skulls depicted on Chichen Itza's tzompantli are not necessarily identical. Rather, some heads are skeletal, while others combine both fleshed and skeletal features. So these types of structures have low relief representation of skulls on the side, but they also would have had like probably stakes with actual human skulls on top. So you would have seen perhaps some of these heads as skulls, just bone, and some as, you know, perhaps entirely fleshed, and some kind of in the stages in the middle. The experience of viewing life, death, and dying at Mayapán was not identical to that of Chichen Itza, but it was still powerful. Chichen Itza's tzompantli is massive, with hundreds of sculpted heads. It is a scene of sacrificed life on a colossal scale, even from a distance. Mayapán's presentation of the space between life and death is more intimate. You have to come closer to this thing. A closer look is necessary. The frieze and its subject matter, complete with framed and decapitated heads, beckons the viewer closer. That special ritual of seeing, where objects are bounded by a frame in defined, specialized space, creates a more profound experience for the viewer. Interpreted in this manner, the frieze's niches could focus the viewer's attention on the journey between life and death, and the sacrifice and struggle inherent to that journey. The niche frames would force the viewer to pay close attention to heads in all stages of decomposition, losing skin, tissue, eyes, and eventually presenting the viewer with a juxtaposition of bone underneath. In essence, life would be viewed as slipping off to reveal death beneath. The figure would, in effect, be seen as offering its eats over time and struggling explicitly, and this idea of struggle between life and death explicitly shown just through materiality, through material. What is particularly noteworthy of the niches and their associated sculptural bodies is that in 2 of the 3 cases where the figures have niches for heads, their upper torsos are skeletal, while their lower torsos and their extremities are not, as in this figure. If fleshed heads were originally inserted into the niches and left to decompose, they could eventually match the stucco torsos beneath them by turning from flesh into bone. This would have been an ingenious artistic ploy, bringing visual attention to the process of dying, and thereby making the space one of movement and change, a space where the prototype or that energy was seemingly alive. Another interpretation of the niches is the possibility that the heads placed there were already defleshed, as could have been the case in the practices of ancestor veneration. This, however, does not negate the position that the use of heads in the composition were meant to reference life-death struggles. There is something about a defleshed skull that directly references that which it absolutely no longer is, a head that maintains the materials of life. Ancestral bones, therefore, remained a reference to cycles, to journeys undertaken as part of those cycles, to the passage of time, to the opposite constructions of life and death, and teot, to the present, to the struggle teot, and to the presence of sacred eights. It was also possible, however, that some or all of the niches remained empty for stretches of time, and some may never have contained skulls at all. Such voids were still visual reflections of cyclical journeys between life and death, and the sacrifice and struggle of those binary pairs. A shadowy rectangular void in the place of a head over a body, for example, is suggestive of decapitation, practice that was widespread among the Maya, as has been noted. The niched voids may therefore have acted in a similar way to iconography on the face of the tzompantli we saw at Chichen Itza. Both Mayapán's vacant niches and the tzompantli's bodiless skulls would have called attention to decapitation as a primary means of sacrifice. Such sacrifice often resulted in the offering of sacred eats as an assurance of agricultural and cosmological cycles. The use of sculpture to enliven and even guide architectural planning suggests that this artistic genre maintained a high degree of importance and power. Sculpture was a material technology par excellence for bringing the prototype or energies into the world in Mesoamerica. Certainly, some of the most celebrated public sculptures in the Maya region and in the history of Maya art are the stela of the late classic period sites. Often erected to mark important, so these are much earlier, but they're still Maya and in a different area. Often erected to mark important cosmological and political dates, these sculptures depict powerful rulers carved naturalistically into stone and set within carefully curated architectural spaces. Stela depicted the image of the ruler, usually male, with accompanying text naming him, defining his parentage and children, dating his birth and reign, and narrating other parts of his life. However, it was not only the naturalistic rendering of the ruler's likeness and accompanying epigraphic documentation that made the stela so impactful, it was the inherent capacity of stone itself to embody the energies of life. As Mayanist David Stewart has explored through archaeological, linguistic, and epigraphic evidence, or looking at the glyphs, stone stela during the late Classic were understood as the very extension of royal cells into public space, rather than serving as a canvas for portraying mere likenesses of them. Inscriptions on many of these carved stones, for example, name the naturalistically rendered portraits as the stones owned and physically inhabited by those depicted on them. The late Classic stone stela were extensions of the actual body and energies of the king into the space of his court. Sculptures at Mayapán followed in a similar tradition. Rather than representing divine rulers cast in stone, as in the late Classic tradition, that political system had disintegrated before Mayapán rose to power, the frieze embodied principles germane to the post-Classic Mesoamerican political world. With little need to extend the presence of divine kings, there was a different type of rulership now, so there weren't necessarily divine kings who inherited rule automatically. Mayapán's post-classic sculptors, versed in artistic, metaphysical, and cosmological themes shared between the Maya world and central Mexico, created instead spaces for the convergence of both traditional Maya energies, such as eats, but also Central Mexican concepts like teod, and in particular, the struggle inherent to that concept. The artists of the Castillo frieze brought these forth not in stone, but in painted stucco. Like the stone stela before them, the figures of the Castillo stucco frieze were carved with attention to naturalistic representation for the time, and were executed in high relief. As one approaches, so just kind of place yourself in the space of this stucco frieze and think about approaching it on the left. As one approaches, the sun animates the scene in its play over the highly modeled bodies with raised arms and legs. The sun's rays at once highlight these bodies while also disappearing into their shadowy contours. This suggests that even beyond iconographic representation, artists thought about materiality as an agentive and alive element in its own right. The association between stone and life has already been introduced. However, the relationships between life and other earthen materials are also well documented for the Maya. We know from the early 18th century Popol Vuh, the story of creation according to the Quiche Maya, that in one iteration of creating humans, the gods fashioned people from clay. Like stucco, clay is associated with the earth and water, and both are substances that rely on the touch of human hands to model them into organic form. They are, in a sense, both corporeal materials. Maya epigrapher Dmitry Balyev and Albert Davelstein have shown that associations between humans, clay, and divine creation were present in late Classic Maya art as well. One analysis comes from the imagery and associated texts on vessel K7447, which is clearly not what the Maya would have called this vessel, but that's how it's cataloged. So we're seeing a rollout from the vessel in black and white on the right. So these were beautiful ceramic vessels that were brightly painted, but this is the black and white version so that we can see some of the detail better. And it's kind of rolled out flat so that we can see all sides of the vessel at once. In this scene, we see God D and his courtiers holding representations of human faces and artist tools. So they're kind of sitting down and holding these faces in their hands with artist tools. And the associated text at the top, those are glyphs, reads, "On the day 6, Manik 5 Wo, he shaped from the clay." Considering both iconographic and epigraphic evidence from the vessels, the authors believe this shaping from clay, or that saying at the top, refers to the creation of humans by the gods. Oral histories reinforce this reading as Maya communities, including those of the Tzotzil Maya in the town of San Juan Chamula, Chiapas, Mexico, recount the connections between clay and life in storytelling traditions. The late classic colonial and modern examples above show that associations between human creation and earthen materials such as clay, stone, and stucco were also present during the post-classic. These associations are further supported by the very properties of clay and stucco. Such materials can be modeled into human forms in manners that convey organic or living qualities. These substances dry to be smooth like human skin, but are also hard and protective. Like skin, clay and stucco take in the sun's heat, and become especially warm when facing the sun, a property that Maya potters and sculptors took wide advantage of in the tropical heat of southern Mexico and Central America. In the selected composition, such as the east-facing frieze that we're looking at on Mayapán's Castillo, the sun becomes as much a part of the work as other materials used. That relationship is equally defined by the sun's absence. Though the sun at certain times heats up and enlivens the organically modeled bodies in the frieze, it is voided by the deep and strictly square niches that take the place of some of the figures' heads. The niches are places absent of the sun's heat and light, but filled with the sun's opposite, the darkness and cool of night. Should skeletal or freshly decapitated and fleshed heads have been placed in these dark recesses, the contrast between life and death would have been doubly clear to the post-classic viewer. The dark recesses of the niches held death, decay, and the slow but assured loss of life. At the same time, the sun's light animated highly modeled and naturalistic bodies. The sun was a reminder of the day, life, and the upper world, while the dark niches reflected night, death, and the underworld. This solar interaction over the frieze and its niches embodies the journey that the sun itself was doomed to take, as in both Aztec and Maya belief systems. The personified sun was born out of sacrifice and inhabited underworld places at night until it reemerged the next day. We are in the home stretch. The Castillo frieze ultimately created a powerful space where Maya and Aztec metaphysical energies lived and moved. In its iconographic and material focus on themes of sacrifice, dueling binaries, world order, and cyclical journeys, the frieze, much like Qin Shi Huangdi's tomb in China, created the conditions for these energies to be intensely encountered. In Gel's perspective, the prototypes Itz and Tiot were embodied to inhabit the material index of the viewer's world, or the thing right in front of us. In essence, these energies reached through the stucco frieze itself. This agency was further reinforced by aligning the frieze and the Castillo to powerful astronomical bodies thought to be living entities, including the sun, and binding the entire complex to the cenote, or that sinkhole, called Chenmul, which is actually directly below this pyramid. Together with the very likely inclusion of human heads in the niches, the distinction between concept and reality was effectively erased. The creation of heightened experiences echoes perhaps the most fundamental manner in which the Maya Castillo frieze enacted its agency within the social network it was part of. Though we may never know exactly how these experiences felt, the visuality and the context of the frieze discussed in previous sections provide us with clues. The figures of the Mayapán Castillo frieze want something from us. More accurately, the frieze wanted something from those it was created for. Its iconography is clearly a reflection on cycles and the concepts of duality that were intimately linked to those cycles. Furthermore, such iconography tells us that cosmological and human existence, as well as associated agricultural fertility, remain balanced only through energies produced from sacrifice and struggle. This reading is supported by the frieze's materiality as well. The high relief stucco forms, modeled naturalistically and complete with anatomically sculpted ribs in some cases, are reflections of our own bodies. These bodies come out into our space, or rather, we are in theirs. Frame niches bring us closer. Our line of sight becomes the figure's line of sight, our eyes and our heads theirs. Alternatively, we could be looking at the faces of ancestors or sacrificial victims. In each of these cases, we are reminded of, or better yet, we are part of, cycles of sacred time and the primordial places associated with those cycles. In our bodily or phenomenological relationship to the figures, and through their materiality and their location at the center of the world, we come to understand that human sacrifice is necessary to keeping that world balanced and continual. Imagery imbued with these life energies and even creating these energies tied people not only to shared philosophical and cosmological beliefs, but to Mayapán itself, a new socio-political player in a Mesoamerican world system that was shifting quickly. Eventually, politics and religious systems within Mayapán itself would change, and along with those changes would come new religious beliefs and new socio-political hierarchies. In the latter half of Mayapán's existence, construction began on the Temple of Kukulkan, this larger temple that we're seeing encasing it, as a clear testament of devotion to a new deity, the feathered serpent deity, who was once popular at the neighboring terminal classic giant Chichen Itza. At Mayapán, the Temple of Kukulkan encased the original Castillo, and the Castillo frieze was eventually entombed within the Temple of Kukulkan's southeastern facade, which is what we're seeing here by that arrow. Though it was a maneuver intended to visualize the supremacy of a new deity and very likely a new ruling family, the encasing of the Castillo frieze, in my opinion, was also an act of preoccupation, considering that those who encased the frieze believed it had agency. I believe it's an ironic twist in the story of socio-political and religious change at the center. And the very fact that the stucco sculptures were intentionally and carefully entombed is the clearest evidence I believe we have that the figures ever once and most powerfully lived in that space. And that's what I have for today.
That was great. That was great, Khristin. Thank you so much. It's a lot of awesome information in there. We have time for a few questions. If anybody has any questions, you could put them in the chat or raise your hand. Well, I'll start us off. I got questions. First of all, I don't know a whole lot about pre-Columbian art, so it was really interesting to dive so deeply into that and help me, I think, start to contextualize Mayan naturalism a little bit more, which I thought was really interesting in terms of what you were saying about the way in which they manifest those energies, I think. So that was really interesting. But one thing I wanted to ask you about, I was particularly fascinated by, was the focus on the materiality, right? The juxtaposition between the organic heads and skulls and their possible decomposition over time with the durability and more permanence of stone. But then found it really interesting that, in fact, from what I understand, the durability of stone was less of an issue and more in terms of its affordances of how it would engage with the environment and become enlivened through light and heat. I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about their interest in materials in that way and how the relationship with stone, I guess, and how that becomes more manifest.
Yeah, so this is a great question. And I know we have an archaeologist in the crowd who's gonna call me out, but I don't think that those categories have to necessarily be different from one another. So I think that, well, it's not just me thinking, we do have epigraphic or like text evidence for the way that the Maya, at least during the late classic and an earlier time period when they were using a lot of stone, well, they use a lot of stone later, but those stela or those portraits of kings that I showed you come from slightly earlier time period. And in many cases, there's glyphs on those stela that talk a little bit about the ruler and their parentage and they conquered and how cool they were and what they built and when they were born and when they died. But in some cases, some of those glyphs and in other kinds of contexts talk about stone as this kind of alive material, as a way that it provides an extension for like almost, I don't want to say the soul, but like the presence or the energy, this sort of like divine energy to be materialized in different kinds of spaces. But at the same time, I mean, clearly, stone is durable and they want these things to last. I mean, there's a real preoccupation with longevity and lasting. And so I think that they're using certain kinds of materials because first and foremost, they're very practical and they have them, like stone. And so they're using those kinds of things to be durable and powerful and long lasting. But I think possibly even because of that, they're attaching all sorts of more kind of creation related or ideological cosmological principles or powers to those kinds of materials that they're using a lot in terms of representing their most important people or in terms of creating their temples. So we know, for example, that there's a lot of transference between material and cosmology, that their temples they would craft into these mountains, and they called them as such, and they called whole cities as kind of these altipetals in the Aztec world that were supposed to be, that was another name for saying water mountain. So there's a lot of crossover between the natural landscape and then kind of relating that to socio-political, ideological interests or cosmological interests related to creation. So I think that they are certainly using things like stone, like stucco, because it's durable and you can paint easily. The stucco friezes at Mayapán and the stucco temple, or the temples oftentimes had plaster stucco over them, and that would be painted. And of course, that's a material that you can easily paint over. So there's reasons that they're doing it for practicality, but I think that in most Native American traditions in the ancestral Americas, I prefer to say ancestral instead of ancient, but you can think of ancient. In the ancient Americas, I don't think that there's this division that we have in the West, or at least in contemporary thought, where materials are used for practical reasons and don't have all of these other kind of more religious or political significance to them. And so I think that hopefully is answering your question, Dr. Greg, that there's this interconnection always between materials and landscape in terms of both practicality, but in terms of these religious beliefs, or these beliefs in creation, or these beliefs in the presence of rulers, or interconnectivity in sort of socio-political systems. I don't think that there were separations in the way that we make them, which makes things a bit more complicated to discuss, I think, because we're so used to thinking of like, oh, I have like a building material here, right? I have wood that I'm going to make into these earrings. But, at the same time, those materials have, and we know this from art history and the evidence it provides us, but also from like glyphs. They literally told us like wood means this, or like greenstone is related to water and agricultural fertility. It might be practical for making jewelry that's very cool and lasts, but because it's hard, right? But it has all of these other properties to it that are deeply embedded in Mesoamerican thought.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I thought Nicole Lazo had a question, but perhaps not anymore. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Hi, Nicole.
Hi, how's it going?
Good.
I was just wondering if this was a very common scene throughout Mayapán, or if this was something specific to this one pyramid, or just common in the Mayan world in the friezes, not just in the codexes.
So this frieze is unique. I've not seen anything there's nothing that looks exactly like it. However, as part of the talk, I was hoping to make the connection between this pose being very ubiquitous. So this like 4-part pose is something we see like in the Aztec region with that Aztec deity in that birthing pose. And we see this idea of like a quadripartite space very frequently throughout Mesoamerica for thousands of years. So it's something that we probably see 4,000 years earlier in an area or 3,000 years earlier, at least in an area referred to as the Olmec region in the Gulf of Mexico. But the specific iconography and the way it's rendered is unique to that space. And actually Mayapán has a lot of very like weird, unique art. Actually, this frieze is near and dear to my heart because when I was searching for dissertation topics, I had like kind of given up. I've been to all these other sides I was supposed to see that were prettier. And I was like, I don't know. I was like, I'm gonna head to the beach. And then on the way home, like the person I was traveling with is like, let's stop at this site. I think you'd like it. I was like, all right. So yeah, we stopped there and I saw these guys. I was like, God, it's so weird and cool. And that's like got me. So
Great,
but
thank
we
you.
can talk more. Yeah.
Thank you.
And Kellen had a question in the chat. They're asking, how are some of these representations and materialities affected by colonial occupation? Do these ideologies endure in any way?
That's a great question. Thanks, Kellen. So yes, so a lot of what we know, we read back from not only more contemporary ethnography, but from colonial records that we have. So certainly some of those ideologies are there and present and documented in one way or the other from the colonial period in both the Maya region as well as in central Mexico where the Aztec are. So we have 4 of those books that I showed you from the Maya region that are pre-conquest, pre-Spanish conquest. But we actually have more of those books from the following colonial period that document a lot of these things that are really interesting works of syncretism between the Spanish and indigenous world in the Americas. But yes, so the short answer is yes, they endure. I mean, certainly the Spanish were not excited about the human sacrifice, even though, you know, we can talk about the way that the Spanish were more or less like, you know, sacrificing in different kinds of ways, human life. But in the way that the Aztec and the Maya were sacrificing, they just thought it was sacrilegious and so tried to stamp it out as they saw it. However, they were also interested in it and tried to document it. And in many ways, literally, some of these practices went underground into the cenotes or caves. So we have a lot of like deities from those spaces where people were trying to still practice these kinds of sacrificial rituals. And today, even though people aren't sacrificing other people, there are related rituals like this.
That's great. Any last question? Okay, I guess that's all we have time for.
Thank you. I'm sorry, that was a little long.
No, that's great. That's great. Thanks. It was really interesting. I loved it. So we recorded it and we'll make it available to other people. I had a couple of requests of people who couldn't make it. So thank you so much for doing it. It's great.
Thank you for the invite. It's so lovely to see so many of my students here and friends and you.
Good.
And Alex.
Good. All right. Take care, everybody.
Have a good day. Bye.